everyone, it is Dr. T joining on back here. We are officially in spring and we have started a new month. So happy spring to everyone. We have a very important talk today. So it's been come to my attention that you guys have been word searching alopecia. I wonder why. Let's sip on some tea and talk about it, okay? So, of course, with the recent incident, everyone has been trying to understand more about alopecia, which is great. We do want people to be informed. We want people to know what alopecia is. So let's start with just the basics. So alopecia is something that I encounter as an OBGYN. You may be saying, but you're not a dermatologist. Why are you talking about alopecia? And I'm certainly not going to go into the absolute details. I want you to do that with your healthcare team so that you can get the information that's appropriate for you and your history, your family history, what's going on in your biochemistry, what's going on in your life. I want you to get that individualized care. Today, I'm going to be talking more in general from an OBGYN perspective because we encounter alopecia all the time. Why? Because oftentimes we are the very first primary care clinician. I know some people don't think of OBGYN as a primary care clinician, but for women, we are, because sometimes we are the only clinician that women will actually see in the office. And oftentimes, because of our intimate, beautifully intimate relationship, women will oftentimes tell us initially about problems that they find a little bit more embarrassing or a little bit more sensitive areas, such as alopecia. And when we see alopecia, we're oftentimes the ones who are starting the evaluations for the alopecia. And so it's really important for us to know something about alopecia, something about the initial workup, something about the connection of alopecia to the general body, what's going on in the body, what's going on in the life of the woman, because we don't just treat the physical person or even a mental person, but also environmentally what's going on, socially what's going on. All of these key important factors in a woman's life play into what then is expressed by genes that are either turned off or turned on, right? You guys are following me? Awesome. So let's start with the word alopecia to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. So alopecia is in general just hair loss, right? And there are different types of alopecia. And what's really important to know is that alopecia just doesn't happen on the scalp. It is a condition that affects the entire body, but oftentimes because of the link of alopecia to our body image, to our beauty image, this is the area that we oftentimes notice first, and oftentimes the area that will cause us to seek medical attention to try to figure out what's going on. And so just to keep in mind that alopecia is just not a scalp condition, is a hair loss condition. So anywhere on your body that you grow hair, you can experience alopecia. So one of the unique things, as I've already alluded to, which is why we've been sipping on our teas, is that the recent incident has really brought to mind the very close connection between our hair of all types, right? So loss of hair, overgrowth of hair in certain areas, that is another condition called hirsutism. We'll talk about that another time. But hair conditions tend to be very much psychologically linked with our mental health. So there are women who with alopecia who are more likely to have depression issues, more likely to have anxiety issues. And sometimes alopecia, which we'll talk about in a little bit, can be an expression of a psychological issue. And we will talk about that in just a moment. So hang on, I will get to that. But let's talk about the different types of alopecia first. So when we talk about the different types of alopecia, one of the very foundational understanding that we must first explain is that alopecia can be one of two things, right? One of two categories. And then we'll go into the subgroups of those categories. So the first thing is alopecia can either be a condition or a disease that affects the hair follicle. So the hair follicle is damaged or malfunctioning or dysfunctional in some sense. So you're talking about a condition that affects the hair follicle, and that issue then leads to hair loss. Or you can talk about conditions in which the hair follicle itself is actually healthy and doesn't have any underlying condition or disease, but the hair loss is due to a change in the cycle or something that affects the cycling of hair growth. So hair growth is not a constant. So our hair goes through different phases. There are three main phases. I'm not going to go into those details. Or you, if you want to, you can definitely go ahead and look that up. But in general, the hair growth goes through different phases. It goes through a rapid growth phase, and then it goes through a phase where it's not rapidly growing, and then it goes through a phase, and there are different things that happen in the blood vessels in which the blood supply and the hair follicle become disconnected, and all these very details. But you have a rapid growth phase, a inactivation of the growth phase, and then you have a rest period. Real interesting, right? It's so interesting. Side note, you guys, it's so interesting how everything about nature, everything about the physiology of the human body follows really key principles of life. Okay, so I'm gonna leave that right there. I'm not gonna preach to y'all today, but I'm gonna drop that with y'all. Okay, and it's just really interesting how I'm just noticing all these consistencies in terms of principles of life, as well as principles of the way things in the world, when it's not out of function, we're talking about the natural native function of things, follow certain principles, and those principles are very consistent. So hair follicles are no different. Hair follicles go through a rapid growth phase, a sort of stability phase, and then a rest phase. Okay. Let that drop in your spirit. Okay, moving right along. So let's talk about the different major categories of hair growth. So the most common form of hair loss is actually androgenetic alopecia. Okay, so this is a condition that affects both men and women. It is the most common type of hair loss in both men and women. So one of the underlying sort of function of hair follicles is the use of testosterone, right? So when we hear androgens, androgenetic, we're oftentimes thinking of male pattern, and perhaps this is not how we should categorize it, but this is how we actually categorize different types of hormones. So when we think of hormones, when it comes to sex hormones, we think of those hormones that are pro male phenotype or male physical appearance, and the hormones that are more phenotype for women that present with a stereotypical cis woman appearance, right? And conditions that are associated with both genders. And so when we think of androgen, we're thinking of testosterone. And so at the hair follicles, there are androgen receptors, and those androgen receptors can then either lead to the turning on of androgenic genes, which then leads to certain outcomes. And so for individuals who are affected by male pattern baldness or female pattern baldness, in which we're referring to androgenic hair loss, we are talking about the activation of these androgen receptors. So when we're talking about this type of alopecia, we're talking about a type of alopecia in which the receptors, the androgen receptors, are activated by dihydrotestosterone. So testosterone is converted into dihydrotestosterone, which is the type that then activates androgen receptors at the hair follicles. This condition doesn't affect the hair follicles. So remember, I talked about two categories of alopecia. This is one of those conditions in which the hair follicle itself is healthy, but the activation of the androgen receptors then leads to a change in the way the hair goes through the hair cycle that I mentioned before. And gradually what happens is that you get a thinning and a shortening of the hair with each additional cycle. And so women in particular will experience this type of hair loss in what we call the vertex area, as well as the sort of temporal areas and in the parietal area in the back. I would definitely tell you this is something that has personally affected me. So if you look closely, you'll see sort of a thinning of my hair on the temporal regions. And if you can look in the back, my hairstylist, she knows this very well, you will see a thinning in that parietal area. When we say temporal and parietal, we're referring to certain locations of the brain, certain lobes of the brain, but it gives us a good way of referencing the locations in the head that we're talking about. So one of the very important things about this particular type of alopecia is the fact that almost everyone experiences this type of alopecia, some more pronounced than others, right? So when I initially started to experience this type of alopecia, I started to wonder, what is going on with me? What's going on with me? And then I started to notice, as I looked at other family members, that I was actually seeing the same type of thinning in the same type of areas, just to different degrees. And so the very important thing to know is this effect, almost everyone has some degree of androgenetic alopecia, just to very differing degrees. And sometimes in most cases, it's so insufficient, or the amount of hair loss is so minimal that it's oftentimes unnoticed, or people just kind of cover up those areas because it's minimal. So a lot of times, some of us can't do those baby hairs. Of note, this particular type of alopecia actually can affect anyone from the ages of, usually presents between 12 and 40, which is actually when mine started as well. So I can definitely co-sign that that's my personal experience as well. By the time I hit 40, it was a lot more pronounced, but it had already started in my 30s. I won't go into the details of sort of the physiology behind this, but it's really interesting. So for those who have especially conditions, other types of conditions that may be particularly linked to this, definitely take note. If you have abnormal hair growth, in addition to abnormal hair loss, that's something that you should bring to the attention of your healthcare professional. And maybe in a later video, I'll explain why, but not right now, because we have a lot of other things to discuss. Okay, so the next condition we're going to talk about is telogen effluvium. Telogen effluvium is a condition that affects the distribution of hair. So it shifts the hair distribution from one phase to another. So this again is a condition that doesn't affect the actual hair follicle, but more the hair cycle. The important thing about telogen effluvium alopecia is the fact that it is oftentimes self-limited, and usually you'll see the onset of the hair loss about 2 to 4 months after the onset of the condition that initiated the hair loss to begin with. And so some people may see hair loss. One of the most common causes of telogen effluvium is actually stress. So when increased stress has been associated with this particular condition, but there are a number of other conditions that can also affect your hair growth. So you have stress, you have certain types of medications, certain medical conditions can also affect your hair growth and your hair growth distribution. So these are the individuals that will see loose hair in the shower. We'll see handful of hair coming out at a particular time. One of the most common times in which we encounter this condition in the OBGYN office is in the postpartum period. So postpartum hair loss is a type of telogen effluvium. The important thing to know about postpartum hair loss is that it's really not truly hair loss. It's sort of a regression back to your normal state. And so what happens during pregnancy with the hormonal changes is you actually do have an increase in hair growth. You have an increase in hair distribution. That's why pregnant women oftentimes, not in every single case, but for the majority, will see a thicker, more beautiful flowing bouncy hair. The hair volume will increase. You will have just a healthier looking head of hair. What happens in the postpartum period when the body goes through the changes and regresses to a non-pregnant state is that you get a down regulation of the hair growth. And so it's not truly a hair loss from your baseline. It is just a down regulation from what happened from the hair growth you experienced during pregnancy. And this can look and feel pretty significant. Again, everyone has hair loss to different degrees. Now, keep in mind that there are other factors that may be secondary or in conjunction with this. So oftentimes in a postpartum period, what happens? We have women who have an increased experience of stress, certainly a decrease in the amount of sleep that you're getting. Certainly some women have less support at home than others, so their stress level may be higher. Some women may not be getting as much nutrition as others. And so there are other factors that may play into why some women experience this to a lesser degree and others to a much more greater degree. However, all hair loss should be evaluated to make sure that there's no other secondary issues. I mentioned nutrition. So one of the common causes of hair loss has to do with nutrition. And so this is a very easily addressed underlying cause of alopecia. And that's why it's important to take a full history and to pay attention to what's going on in the woman's entire life, because nutritional deficiencies can be a very significant cause for hair loss. One of the most common being iron. So iron deficiency, anemia can be a significant cause of hair loss, and so does vitamin D. So we've been talking about vitamin D a lot as a result of the pandemic. Well, here's another important function of vitamin D. There are certainly a number of others. We talked about vitamin D in terms of your immune system during the pandemic, vitamin D in terms of bone health, which is why we have fortified foods, vitamin D in terms of your mental health and the possible link with depression. And here is another important function of vitamin D is the health of your hair. So having a good sufficient amount of vitamin D, whether it's from direct sun exposure, minimal sun exposure, because you don't want to increase your chances of skin cancer. So it's quite a balance. So preferably ingest the vitamin D through your foods, through fortified foods, as well as supplementation. Another important nutritional source is zinc. So zinc has also been linked to here, and there's certainly a number of others that are not as common, such as your vitamin E and your vitamin C levels. And certainly people have been paying lots of attention to biotin, but the important thing to know is biotin is actually not a common nutritional deficiency. And so when you are looking for nutritional sources or causes of your underlying hair loss, make sure that you're not overlooking the major ones and going for the more esoteric ones, just simply because of commercial marketing. Okay, so make sure that you are aware of the more common causes of your hair loss related nutritional deficiencies. Again, that's iron. We talked about iron. We talked about vitamin D. We talked about zinc. Selenium is also another important one, but again, selenium deficiencies are not as common. And certainly biotin, which is one of your more important vitamin Bs. However, again, biotin deficiencies are actually not very common. And when you talk to dermatologists, they will let you know that it's not one of the primary supplements or products that they advocate for because of that. Okay, and let's talk about hormonal imbalances. So we talk about hormonal imbalances in terms of the sex hormones, but let's talk about other hormones that actually can impact your hair loss. So thyroid being one of those. I too am a thyroid, I hate the word sufferer, but affected by my thyroid, put it that way. Thankfully, it's been stable. But thyroid disease can actually present as hair loss. And thyroid disease and thyroid disorders in general are more common in women. So if you are experiencing hair loss of a significant degree, a degree which is essentially a degree that concerns you. So if it concerns you, it's significant. Definitely make sure that you've had your routine thyroid testing and evaluation of your thyroid to make sure it is not impacting your hair growth or hair loss, okay? And in addition to that, different types of infections as well as diet. So we talked about nutritional imbalance, but certainly lack of protein. Protein is the basic building blocks for everything in the entire human body. And so if you don't have enough protein because you're on a special diet, it is very possible that you may experience hair loss as a result of that. All right, so the next form of hair loss we're going to talk about is cicatricial hair loss. So cicatricial hair loss, now we are talking about damaged hair follicles. So we've moved out of the category where the hair follicles are pretty much not damage, into a category where you have actual damaging of the hair follicles. And there are a number of different elements that could play into this. So for example, some people have damaged hair follicles as a result of burns, whether it is heat burn, whether it is a destruction of the scalp from radiation therapy. Some people experience damaging of the hair follicles from different types of infection. So syphilis can affect the hair follicles. So can AIDS as a result of the HIV infection. So can tuberculosis affect the hair follicles, as well as herpes zoster can also affect the hair follicles. So very important, again, to get what? A complete medical history, because infection, which some of these particular types of infection, you will see other symptoms and you will get important information and clues from a person's history as to whether or not their hair loss is as a result of one of these types of infections. And then you have autoimmune diseases. So this is not the autoimmune disease that directly affects the hair follicle. We'll talk about that because I know that's what y'all want to learn about, but we'll get to that. I'm coming. But let's first talk about autoimmune diseases that as a secondary impact can impact the hair follicles and damage the hair follicles. So one of the very common, especially in the people of color, is lupus. Lupus can affect the hair follicles as well as sarcoidosis. So these are autoimmune diseases that are more generalized autoimmune diseases affecting multiple organ systems. The hair and the scalp is just another organ system that is experiencing a secondary effect on the hair follicle as a result of these autoimmune diseases. You got me? All right. The other type of alopecia that I do want to talk about is your traumatic alopecia, right? So this is why your hairstylist will say, vary your hairstyle, right? Because you don't want to have constant tensioning of your hair follicles. That will damage your scalp and cause traction on the hair follicles and cause hair loss as a result of it. So it is so important to vary your hairstyles and make sure your hairstylist gives you minimal tensioning on your hair follicles. You do not want your hair follicles under constant tensioning, or you may experience traumatic alopecia. Okay, so I alluded to earlier that there may be a psychological condition that is linked to hair loss, and that is trichotillomania. Say that 1,000 times fast. Trichotillomania. Okay, so trichotillomania are individuals who are actually pulling their hair out. It is a psychogenic condition. It is important, once again, to get a complete history so that you can be able to identify those who may be suffering from trichotillomania. Say that 1,000 times fast. Okay, so now let's move on to the condition you guys have all been searching on the internet for. Okay, I'm not going to talk about the T because we don't talk about the people on HPC, we talk about the problem. And I'm actually really glad that this came up because it's really allowing us an opportunity to talk about alopecia because it affects men and women. It affects individuals of all different age groups. So the type of tea that we're spilling is only the tea that helps to educate you and inform you regarding the underlying condition. So let's talk about alopecia areata. Alopecia areata is actually a condition in which the body attacks the hair follicles. So this condition is one of the categories. Remember, we talked going back to those two categories. We have those that affect the hair cycle, and we have conditions that affect the actual hair follicles. So this is a condition in which the hair follicle is being attacked by the body's immune system. So this is considered to be an autoimmune disease, different from the autoimmune diseases that I talked about before, which were autoimmune diseases that were occurring elsewhere, in which the hair follicles were a secondary effect of the actual immune condition like lupus and sarcoidosis. This is a condition in which the direct autoimmune attack is on the hair follicle itself. You understood that difference? We have secondary, we have primary. This is a primary autoimmune disease of the hair follicles. And so this can actually affect both men and women equally. right? Men and women of any age group. It is actually more common in childhood and childhood and young adult age groups. This can affect up to 2% of the population in the entire world is affected by this condition. If you think about the population in the United States alone, we're talking about at least 6 to 8 million people who are affected by this condition. That's a lot of people. What's interesting in this condition versus some of the other alopecias that we talked about, where you have generalized hair loss or thinning of the hair, are, certain like androgenetic alopecia, where you have the thinning of particular areas of the scalp. This is a condition in which you can have just random, well circumscribed, patchy losses of hair. So this again is not a thinning of the hair, not a diffuse thinning of the hair, not a generalized hair loss, not a hair loss in particular areas. This is patchy hair loss. And it is a very well circumscribed patchy area in which the individuals will experience the hair loss. Usually the onset of the condition versus when the hair loss may be presented, maybe a duration of about 2 months time period. So the onset to really the significant hair loss is a very short time interval, okay? So again, this is the autoimmune condition that affects directly the hair follicle, resulting in patchy hair loss, can be devastating. This again is a hair loss condition in which you have patchy losses of hair, and you can have multiple patchy areas. You can have isolated patchy areas. Individuals with this condition can spontaneously go into remission and spontaneously have recurrences, very much consistent with autoimmune diseases in general. You guys know that autoimmune diseases, people have time periods in which they have flare-ups and time periods in which everything is calm and stable. So this is no different. This is just another condition in which you may have episodes in which you have a flare-up of the autoimmune condition, and other time period in which you have more quiescent time period. Did I say that correctly? So this can, as you can imagine, having patchy losses of hair can be devastating to both men and women. This is not just a female condition. We just tend to associate women and our beauty more with our hair as compared to men, but men too do experience psychological issues as a result of hair loss. I'm not negating that. I'm not overlooking that. I'm certainly not excluding them from this conversation. So it's important that we are sensitive to people who are experiencing the alopecia of any kind, right? Because of the psychological link. And so, and for people who are sufferers of alopecia, to know that it is important not just to address your physical health while you're undergoing whatever treatments you are undergoing based on the type of alopecia that you have, but also that you seek psychological help so that you heal, as with any medical condition, so that you heal psychologically and can deal with it, right? Because it can be traumatic, just like abnormal hair growth issues. So we don't want to overlook the link, the very strong psychological link based on, a lot of it is based on our society and set standards and beauty standards of society. And so the decision to go bald, the decision for men and women, or the decision to wear wigs as a result of it, not by choice, but because you feel like you have no other choice, is a very challenging condition. So keeping that in mind, let's understand that it's a journey for everyone, and not everyone is on the same journey. There are some people who are psychologically fine. So don't assume that because someone has alopecia and had to shave their head, that they are psychologically damaged of any kind. That is not true. As mentioned, we are all affected by different diseases and conditions to a different degree, and not everyone's journey is the same, but let's be sensitive to someone's journey and be compassionate to one another, okay? And in the end of it all, let's destigmatize a lot of these issues so that people can walk around with their beautiful bald head. And I do have some beautiful bald heads in my life, and I see you guys. I love you guys. You guys are amazing. You guys are inspiring. Those who have decided to go bald as a result of underlying conditions, and those who just decided that that's just how they want to rock and want to flow, and we are here for it, okay? But in general, this is what I want to leave with you. There are different types of hair of alopecia, hair loss, right? And we talked about the major categories, those that affect the hair follicle and those that affect the cycle of the hair, the natural hair cycle. But what I want you to take away with you most of all is the fact that when we are talking about the scalp, we cannot isolate the scalp to determine what's going on with an individual. We talked about different types of conditions. We talked about infection. We talked about medication. We talked about thyroid disease and other hormonal imbalances. We talked about all these other types of conditions, our stress, psychological impact that affects our hair. So it's important to, when you do notice hair loss, I want you to do one or two things. I want you to note any other symptom that you've had at the same time that seems to correlate with your hair loss. I want you to look at your entire body. I want you to look at the skin on your skin. I want you to look at the hair distribution on your entire body. I want you to make note of any new medications that you're on. I want you to make note of any type of in the way you style your hair, what styles you've been using. I want you to take note of what's going on in your life psychologically, because all of these things factor into our scalp health. And it is important that we take care of our scalp, not just our hair and our hair. Well, this ain't my hair. You guys know that, but you know what I mean? That we take care of our hair and we take care of our scalp. The scalp is a very important organ. It is a very important part of our health. It can be reflective of what's going on in our body, or it can be a primary location of a disorder or condition. So keep that in mind, and then take all of this information to your healthcare team so that they can help you determine what's going on and treat it. Okay. And keep in mind that an itchy scalp is not normal. A tender or a painful scalp is not normal. Patches are not normal. Looking at discoloration of the scalp, if it's red, that is not normal. So you want to be able to look in the mirror and really evaluate your scalp and see what's going on. If you notice any type of hair loss, to see what is your scalp health. And those are my tips for today. You guys have been amazing. And I hope that you have taken away with you great information so that you can continue to take care of your health, not just on the outside, but also on the inside, you guys, on the mental health and how you love on yourself and you love on not just your scalp, your hair, but your beauty, and appreciate your individual beauty. Okay, you guys, so that is Dr. T, the hand behind the handle of Healthy Bump Club here on YouTube. Make sure you check out our other videos and make sure you check us out on Instagram. We are healthybump.club. And that is all the tea I have for you today. Ladies and gentlemen, go about your business and enjoy your day. Have a wonderful week enjoying and loving on your hair and